And for more, we're joined from Ramallah by Palestinian security analyst Mohammed Najib. But let's begin in the studio with Dr. Emmanuel Navon, senior fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security and International Relations expert. And Emmanuel, we should note here, there's been criticism of this judge's decision, but keep in mind, he himself said that he's not setting a new precedent here. Every one of these cases is going to have to be decided on its own individual merits.
Right. I mean, what this judge was saying, that on the one hand, according to Israeli law, there should be freedom of religion, of religious practice. And what he wrote in his decision is that the bottom line is that, yes, there is a status quo that was decided back in June 1967 between the Waqf and the Minister of Defense at the time, Moshe Dayan. But we're today in 2022. And the fact that the status quo at the time allowed Jews to visit the Temple Mount but not to pray there was an implicit recognition that this site only had a religious significance for the Muslims and not for the Jews. But it does have a significance for the Jews too. Also, at the time, most rabbis didn't allow Jews to access the Temple Mount for fear of desecrating the holies of holies. But today, a lot of rabbis, especially from the Zionist movement, allow Jews to access the Temple Mount and even pray there in certain designated areas. So I think the status quo that was agreed a long time ago needs to be adapted to the fact that today, as I said, more and more Jews are allowed by some rabbis at least to access the Temple Mount. And as I said, the moment you only recognize the right to pray there to Muslims, it's an implicit recognition that the site is only holy to Muslims when it is also holy to Jews. In fact, the fact that it's holy to Islam is because originally it was holy to Jews. And last point, don't forget that the original name for this place and for the city of Jerusalem in Arabic was Bait al-Maqdis, which is an Arabic transliteration of the Hebrew Beit HaMikdash, which means the temple.
Mohammed, we had a pretty concise explanation of Emmanuel, why there are Jews trying to get on the Temple Mount to pray at this time. Give us some more the perspective now of the Palestinian Authority and, of course, the Kingdom of Jordan, which is calling this an infraction of the status quo that has been there since 1967.
Al-Aqsa Mosque is very sensitive for Palestinians, for Jordanians, for Arabs, and for Muslims around the world. The Palestinians, as well as the Muslims, deeply believes that Al-Aqsa Mosque only belongs to the Muslims. The Jews has nothing to do with that. And the Palestinians recall the division of Ibrahim Mosque a few years ago between the Muslims and the Jews. So they think that the Israeli intention is step by step, gradually going to divide the Al-Aqsa Mosque between the Muslims and the Jews, which angered them. And also the calls by the extremist right-wing groups to demolish the Dome of the Rock and to build the Jewish temple in its place, even their concerns from this issue. So the Al-Aqsa is a very sensitive issue, and all the provocations that take from the Israeli side, they increase the anger among them and keep the tension arise all the time.
Right. Emmanuel, I just raised the issue. Of course, we can go back and forth on the religious significance, but as we heard Uri Zaki say, certainly for the current government, their concerns are about security, not about religious practice, whether there's a security imperative at the moment to restrict Jewish prayer there.
But there's always been security concerns, and there always will be. It's not new. There's always a reason to evoke security concerns. But the bottom line is, as I said, that as long as Muslims simply deny the fact that this site also has a significance to Jews, I don't see how we can reach a compromise. And by the way, this was raised and brought up also during previous negotiations between Israel and the Palestinian Authority during the Camp David conference, when Arafat at the time simply refused to recognize the fact that this site also has a significance to the Jews and to Judaism. And I think that as long as Muslims simply refuse to recognize this fact, I don't see how we can reach a compromise. So you can always evoke security concerns here and there. There are always security concerns. But at the end of the day, as I said, the bottom line is that the Muslims have to recognize the significance of this site to the Jews. And then when it comes to modus operandi, this can be discussed and negotiated.
All right. Well, certainly this is one of the more intractable arguments between Israel and the Palestinians and other parts of the Arab world, which is, we saw that, for example, at the Camp David talks. Gentlemen, stay with us. Let's move on, though, to another sensitive issue between Israel and the Palestinians. Israel Defense Forces Advocate General, Brigadier General Yifat Tomer Yerushalmi today said in public statements that the IDF must thoroughly investigate the killing of the Palestinian-American Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, even without having access to the bullet that killed her. Now, this does come as Palestinian Authority Foreign Minister Riyad al-Maliki has submitted a file on the fatal shooting of Abu Akleh to the International Criminal Court in The Hague. And Mohammed, tell us about this. What are the Palestinians trying to achieve here with the ICC in the Abu Akleh case?
Yes, Caleb. The Palestinian people are extremely upset by the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh by the Israeli army, and also by the IDF calls to not to investigate this issue. So the Palestinian Authority has come under heavy pressure from its people that it has to do something to stop the Israeli heavy crackdown on the Palestinians in the West Bank, across the West Bank, and regard the investigation in the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh. So the Palestinian Authority right now did condemn statement, a denouncing statement, and Hussein Sheikh talked to his Israeli counterpart, but it is nothing to do. So they thought that by going to the ICC, it could form a pressure on Israel to stop the attacks and to launch a serious investigation. By the way, Israel has prevented the European Parliament delegation that was planning to come to Israel and to investigate this issue from entry, which angered the European Parliament delegation because of this rejection to their entry to Israel. So the Palestinians as well as the Europeans believes that Israel is not interested in investigation and seriously investigate the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh, and they close this file.
Right. And Emmanuel, Mohammed mentioned the European pressure. We saw even some in Washington, where I think it's about somewhat 50 Congress members of Congress also called for more of a deeper investigation. But clearly, Israeli and Palestinians are not going to cooperate on this. It's hard to see what's going to be achieved.
Well, I'm sorry to say that there isn't a single word of truth in what Mohammed just said. Starting with the European delegation, I actually met them last night, so they are in Israel. Regarding the killing of this journalist, which is obviously unfortunate, but accusing Israel of killing her is unfounded, defamatory, and you cannot accuse something without a proof. Israel has asked for an open investigation. The bullet is being hidden by the Palestinian Authority. They wouldn't hid it if they didn't have anything to hide. If we could examine this bullet, this would solve most of the mystery. So I think that these accusations are part of Palestinian propaganda to try and defame Israel when we need an investigation, but the PA is preventing it by hiding this bullet. At the same time, they go to the International Criminal Court to try to put Israel, to turn Israel into the accused when there's absolutely no evidence. In fact, there's a very high chance that this journalist was killed by Palestinian bullets, but we don't know because the PA won't to deliver this bullet. So I think that here again, and we spoke before about the Temple Mount, it is irresponsible. This attitude is completely irresponsible. It's all about propaganda. It's all about PR, unfortunately. And here Israel, I think, in my opinion, should do the same thing exactly. Israel should go to the ICC and sue the Palestinian Authority to demand this bullet. And if they can do it, why can't we? I mean, we need an investigation. And the Palestinian, as I said, if the PA, the Palestinian Authority, didn't have anything to hide, then he wouldn't hide it.
All right. Mohammed, I want to give you a chance to respond, but just briefly, though, you have about 40 seconds if to relate at least to something of what Emmanuel said.
Shortage of confidence between the Palestinians and the Israelis over this issue. So the Palestinians call for international investigation in that, where they can give the bullets for American or international investigation in this issue. And also the Americans didn't buy the Israeli propaganda about that and they criticized Israel and asked for a serious investigation in the murder of Abu Akleh.
All right. Well, we'll have to see. Of course, there have been calls. Palestinians have called for an international investigation, but without Israel being part of it. And of course, Israel is not going to agree to an international investigation of which it is not part of. And I'm afraid it looks like this is going to be yet another issue in which there doesn't seem like there'll be any compromise to come in the near future. Dr. Emmanuel Navon, Mohammed Najib in Ramallah, thank you for joining us.